It is rich in natural beauty. Age-old live oaks frame broad, beautiful views at every turn. All agree that the loveliest sight is Old Charleston when seen from the bay against the setting sun. It is a town of peaceful, home-loving people, blessed through the ages with contentment. It has been said that the place is more than just a town. It is a state of mind. Within the hectic pace of our busy world, old Mount Pleasant seems almost frozen in time. To discover the origin of this peaceful lifestyle, you must go back in time, far back, to when this was Indian country, when Native Americans hunted the woods and fished the bountiful waters. Travel with me for a look at the challenges faced by our forefathers, discover people and events that helped shape our history and brought Mount Pleasant all the way into 1987, the year of our sesquicentennial. Come with me on a journey through time. It was July the 6th, 1680, when the first settlers came into the area now known as Mount Pleasant and discovered they weren't alone. It was said while the white man was hardly received with open arms, the settlers and the natives did get along fairly well, although it was known that the Indians had a habit of stealing or destroying the settlers' crops on a regular basis. The Indians were from the Santee, Siwee, and Wando tribes. It was on the Neck where our first landowner settled, a member of British Parliament, Florentia O'Sullivan. He was an Irish soldier of fortune, a controversial figure to say the least. He was granted over 2,300 acres and, upon arrival, appointed deputy and surveyor general. He later lost the job as surveyor general after complaints of incompetence, undersized lots, and oversized charges for his services, as one man complained about O'Sullivan's habits: to profess much, to perform nothing. O'Sullivan was assigned the task of establishing a warning system against would-be invaders. He was given a cannon, which he placed on an island at the mouth of the harbor. The island, you guessed it, Sullivan's Island. Another island warning system involved the lighting of fires to tell the townspeople the number of ships approaching. France dearly wanted to add this area to her holdings, and in August of 1706, 5 fires alerted Charlestown to the presence of French forces. When Charlestown refused to surrender, the French landed a force of 160 in the Hobcaw area and overran the plantations. The British responded by sending 100 troops to Hobcaw, where they quickly defeated the invaders. That fight ended France's last threat to the South Carolina colony. In those days, Hobcaw Plantation stretched from Shim Creek to the Wando River. Colonel George Dearsley had a large shipyard there, and in his will spoke of brigantines and other ships both built and under construction. Other landowners were also shipbuilders, and Hobcaw became known as Shipyard Plantation.
This area is where the old shipyard was. Several different people ran the shipyard at this point. Now, these boats came over from Europe and unloaded cobblestones which were carried for ballast. Consequently, this whole area in here, about 300 feet long, is solid cobblestones. And I understand that the ship that captured Stede Bonnet, the pirate, was built here at Hobcaw.
One of the later landowners was a noted shipbuilder named Paul Pritchard. His plantation house survived a number of generations, although the land changed hands several times. Today, this is all that remains of the once noble structure, a few bricks from one of the chimneys. The main house was about 700 feet inland from the shipyard along this avenue of majestic oaks. In those days, the launching of a new ship was cause for celebration, and this avenue became known as Flirtation Walk because of the many young people strolling along hand in hand while attending the day-long events. Who knows, maybe someday the branches of these mighty oaks may once again embrace young lovers.
I expect to preserve it as long as it remains in the McGillivray family. To do so, I am going to set aside 70 to 80 feet, which will encompass the entire avenue. The avenue is approximately 700 feet long. I hope to leave this avenue to my grandson.
There were already some small settlements along the harbor area. Jacob Mott had established Mount Pleasant Plantation, and in 1770, a man by the name of Andrew Hibben obtained a charter to operate a ferry service along Shem Creek to where it meets the harbor. Hibben Ferry was the first to connect this area to Charleston. The Georgetown Road was extended to the Hibben Ferry, making it a part of the main route to and from the north. Hog Island Channel along the Mount Pleasant shoreline was a site of resistance against British rule on at least 2 occasions. One was when the people of Charleston staged their own tea party against British taxes. Casks of tea were brought by boat from Charleston and dumped into the channel. The second was during the Revolutionary War, when British warships stopped merchant ships in Charleston Harbor and seized their cargo. In an effort to hamper British movements, several old sailing ships were scuttled and sunk, 4 of them in Hog Island Channel. We were about 8 months into the war and things were getting rough. Mount Pleasant was about to play a major role in the first naval engagement in the area. Colonel William Moultrie was ordered to build a battery at Hadrill's Point. On the evening of December 19, 1775, Moultrie landed on the shore of Mount Pleasant with more than 200 men. They worked feverishly through the night and morning, building the cannon platform. The gun crews immediately began firing at the 2 British men of war that had been seizing the merchant ship cargo. The British war vessels were driven to Sullivan's Island, but when they were denied food and water supplies, they sailed away. On Sullivan's Island, Colonel Moultrie and others began building a small fort out of sand and palmetto logs. It was the beginning of what we now know as Fort Moultrie.
During the Revolutionary War, at the time that the British were winning, they captured Sullivan's Island, Fort Moultrie, and Mount Pleasant, and used my house, which is at 111 Hibben Street, for their headquarters. And they captured officers of the colonial ones and had them at the house, but they were on parole, which means that they were on their honor, and they could go 6 miles in any direction as long as they didn't cross water, which meant that they had to go up the Georgetown Road. And Moultrie was captured, General Moultrie. And he would visit his friend Colonel Pinckney up at Snee Farm, which is 6 miles up from Mount Pleasant. And while he was here on parole at this house, he received a letter from Lord Montague in England offering him lands in Jamaica and a commission in the British Army if he would desert the American cause and come over to the British side. And Lord Montague's letter was very flowery. And at the end of it, he said that he would give him all these things, and then he said, "Think well of me, Montague." So Moultrie wrote a longer and more flowery letter back, and at the end of his, he said, "You have told me what I would receive if I deserted my country, but you haven't told me where I would hide myself from myself if I did such a dastardly thing." And at the end of his letter, he said, "Think better of me, Moultrie."
General Moultrie's friend, Charles Pinckney, lived at Snee Farm in Mount Pleasant. Of course, he had a townhouse in downtown Charleston on the site of what is now the Calhoun Mansion, 16 Meeting Street. Remember, the planters had townhouses in the city and plantations out in the country, and Pinckney's was out in Snee Farm. And Pinckney, of course, was one of the most important framers of the Constitution. He came to the convention with a draft of the Constitution and was one of the most important members of the Constitutional Convention. James Madison has stolen most of the credit, but Pinckney's contribution was very significant.
After the War for Independence, life in Mount Pleasant returned to normal. The village of Greenwich had already been formed. Jonathan Scott laid out his 100 acres typical of an English village. The 50 acres on the water he divided into lots. The remaining 50 acres were deeded to the lot owners as a common area for their use in gathering firewood. Scott's residential street names honored the sovereigns and the Prime Minister: King Street, Queen Street, and Pitt Street. Today, the streets bordering the old common area are Morrison, Simmons, and McCants. In 1803, Mount Pleasant Plantation was purchased by James Hibben from the estate of Jacob Mott. It was James's father, Andrew Hibben, who established the ferry 30 years earlier. James had the plantation divided into 35 lots to form the village of Mount Pleasant. 6 of the lots were on Beach Street, which really was on a beach back then. 4 new streets were laid out in the village of Mount Pleasant: Bennett, Vinning, Wilden, and Boundary Street, now Simmons. On December the 20th, 1837, the State Assembly approved the incorporation of the villages of Greenwich and Mount Pleasant as one town. The act to incorporate officially established the name of the new town as Mount Pleasant and determined who was eligible to vote. It also allowed for the election of an intendant and 5 wardens, the equivalent of our mayor and town council today, and specified their duties. In addition, it gave the intendant and wardens the power to supervise and maintain roads as well as to provide law enforcement. This 1837 Act of Incorporation is the event we now observe 150 years later. Another settlement in the growing area was by the Hibben Ferry. Shem Creek formed one of its borders. The others were Beach Street along the harbor, Bennett Street, and of course Hibben Street. On the other side of the new town was a large area of land purchased by Charles Juneau and Oliver Hilliard. They formed the Mount Pleasant Ferry Company. Ferry Street was laid out to reach the new business, which was located near Shell Hall, the summer home of Charles Pinckney. The ferry company also laid out what is now Alhambra Park and even built the first Alhambra Hall. This new village was called Hilliardsville. It bordered the new town of Mount Pleasant and extended eastward to the marshes facing Sullivan's Island, and from Bay Street along the harbor to what was then called Common Street, now Royal Avenue. In 1858, Hilliardsville became a part of the town of Mount Pleasant. The 5th settlement at Hadrill's Point was called Lucasville. It was named for Jonathan Lucas, who built a water-driven rice and sawmill along Shem Creek on the site of the old Greenwich Mill. In 1872, the State Assembly extended the boundaries of the town of Mount Pleasant all the way to Shem Creek and Charleston Harbor, taking in the Hibben Ferry settlement and part of Lucasville, northward to what we call Simmons Street. Now, all 5 settlements were part of Mount Pleasant. There was a bucket factory on the corner of what is now Bennett Street and Live Oak Drive.
If you look at some of the aerial photographs, you'll see that creek coming up to the back of the bucket factory, almost to the back of it. It's pretty well in a straight line, and over the centuries it has changed course. But I was told that it was dug by blacks, slaves, at least 200 years ago, and it had about maybe 2 foot of water in it at low tide. High water, they'd maybe have 7 feet of water. And the old centerboard schooners would come in, and they'd pull them up at high tide up that canal behind the bucket factory and load. And high tide, pull them back out and pull right on out of Shem Creek and drop the centerboard and go up Hog Island Channel towards Charleston or wherever the destination was.
By the late 1700s, there was an organized school for white children in the villages. Mount Pleasant Academy was officially incorporated December the 19th, 1809. Its first location is not known for sure, but it was reportedly held in several homes for the beginning years and in the courthouse around the turn of the century. In 1908, the school, still remembered by old-timers in Mount Pleasant, was built on the corner of Pitt and Vinning. It stood where Hines Plumbing and several houses are now located.
We didn't have music, PE, art. We just had the fundamentals and recess. And we went to school at 9 and got out at 2. I remember that distinctly.
Later, the school moved to Coleman Boulevard and Simmons Street, forerunner to the Moultrie High School and the new Moultrie Middle School. Mount Pleasant Academy still exists today as an elementary school located on Center Street. It's well known that the Civil War began with a firing on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in April 1861. Tensions that led to the war between the states, sometimes referred to as the recent unpleasantness, had roots in Mount Pleasant. 7 months earlier, the townspeople met at Ronkin's Long Room, a local tavern, formerly Shell Hall, the summer home of Charles Pinckney. At issue was slavery and the election of Abraham Lincoln as president. It was decided if Lincoln was elected, South Carolina should, quote, determined the best mode of dissolving connection with the present Union, unquote. Mount Pleasant was apparently the first community in the state to vote for secession. South Carolina was the first state to break away from the Union. All Union facilities were immediately seized in the name of the Confederacy, that is, all but one, Fort Sumter. What was later termed the shot heard round the world was fired by Citadel cadets from Morris Island across the harbor from Mount Pleasant. Their target was the steamer Star of the West, which was running supplies to Fort Sumter. One of the cadets who fired that shot was John M. Wilden of Mount Pleasant. Fort Sumter was bombarded from all sides, including from Mount Pleasant. Battery Gary was located a couple hundred yards east of Center Street, giving it a clear shot at the harbor. In addition to the cannons mounted there, the Confederates had a floating gun emplacement between Battery Gary and Sullivan's Island. Both proved to be effective launching cannonballs at Fort Sumter. Located just outside Mount Pleasant, Palmetto Fort is a lesser known, yet significant example of man's will and determination to resist adversity.
Back this way about 1,000 feet is the old Confederate fort that was put up to stop Sherman if he came down the peninsula to go into Charleston from Mount Pleasant. There's an embankment that runs from this fort, from the water here, all the way through Boone Hall to what's now Hallback Creek at Boone Hall. And along the way are 2 or 3 gun emplacements where they had 1 or 2 cannons sitting out, and the bank is in a series of zigs and zags. To any way you came at it, you'd be caught in a crossfire. And they also had a redoubt, which was logs pointing out in the direction they expected the attack to come from. That you had to climb up, climb over a pointed log, and get shot at 2 times from both directions at the same time.
Palmetto Fort was manned for only 1 day, then abandoned when Sherman was reported coming from the south instead of the north. Today, Palmetto Fort remains a lonely tribute to human sacrifice and love of homeland. There were no shortage of volunteers to man the submarine H.L. Hundley, the newest weapon in the Confederate arsenal, and the first submarine of modern design. Just 35 feet long, it sank 4 times during trial runs with disastrous results to her crew. While preparing for their mission under the greatest of secrecy, the men of the 5th crew stayed here at Ronkin's Long Room. And on the evening of February 17, 1864, those men made history when the Hundley sank the enemy sloop Housatonic. The Hundley and her crew were lost in the explosion.
My grandfather was Dr. John Young Dupree, and he fought in the war between the states. And when he came back after the war, he found his old town had been desecrated, but he resumed his practice and did the very best he could with what he had. People didn't have the money to pay him, so they did little nice things for him. And the ladies that he served so long and well all decided to make a quilt for him. On most of these little pieces, it has the initials of the people that made them.
In 1866, after the Civil War, the Quakers sent Miss Cornelia Hancock to make a school for children of the ex-slave. She started the classes in a bombed-out building, the Presbyterian Church on Conahibbon and Church Street, with 50 pupils. The school was well accepted, and after the first 50 children, the enrollment soon reached 200. So the Abolitionist Society sent 3 more teachers and rented a brick mansion, a building big enough for the school and the teachers to occupy. Through the years, it has acted as a training school for people in sewing, cooking, cobbling. In academic work, it was so thorough that the children could leave without fear and enter high school and college and other places.
Mount Pleasant has a small cemetery for the fallen soldiers of the Confederacy. It's on Carr Street next to the present town hall. In this same cemetery is the only monument in the Southeast dedicated to soldiers lost in the War of 1812. A dozen names are inscribed on this monument, a permanent tribute to those who gave their lives for their country. Overlooking the harbor on the edge of Mount Pleasant is a house that sits on history. But for now, what is involved remains a mystery. This house at 203 King Street may have been the site for the original home of Florentia O'Sullivan in the late 1600s. And on this property may have been Fort Queen Anne, built during the Revolutionary War. There's evidence both may be true.
The artifacts that I've seen so far indicate that it is possible that the site was occupied as early as O'Sullivan's life. The problem is that the same artifacts that were used in 1670 were made as late as 1740 or 1750. So without proper contextual information, we can't tell if they were O'Sullivan's or his descendants.
The lady who we bought the home from told us that it had been built on the site of old Fort Queen Anne, which we didn't pay too much attention to. But when I ran into this material and when the state came down and started their dig, we figured that it was Fort Queen Anne. We don't know to this day whether it is or not.
It's difficult to imagine Mount Pleasant with a magnificent beach. But a report from the State Board of Agriculture in 1883 described sand stretching for 1.5 miles along the harbor and ranging from 400 to 1,000 yards wide. Some longtime residents remember it well.
The beach was a nice sandy beach. There was a street called Beach Street right along the edge of the bay. And then the beach was so safe that our parents never bothered about us at all. We went in every time it was high tide or even half tide. And then in low tide, we would go out there and look for soft-shell crabs and fool around in the mud. There was very little marsh and very few oyster shells and hardly any pluff mud.
When I was a kid, my brother and I would come down and we had a sand beach from here to about 2/3 of the way to your tall trees. It was sand all the way basically from Mount Pleasant to McClellanville. In fact, my father, as a young man, said that people going to McClellanville would ride the beach rather than the old shell road because it was not quite as sandy in dry summertime. The shell road, everybody being rutted into one set of ruts, and here you had plenty of room in it. It was much easier on horse and buggy.
My mother wouldn't let me go down to the beach. Why? Because she said, you will drown. I went down to the beach this Monday afternoon, and everybody, come on. No, I ain't coming no farther. And they sent a boy, get Margaret down to the beach. And I had a dress down in this way. When I get down to the beach, they threw me. Oh, God, I almost dead. I said, I know I'm going to get killed because my mom and daddy going to kill me when I get home.
What was life like growing up in Mount Pleasant back in the good old days?
When I was little, I knew every house in Mount Pleasant and every single person that lived in every single house. And we ran the streets of Mount Pleasant as children and swam off the docks. And if we got home late for supper and it was getting a little dark, the only thing we were afraid of were ghosts. We never thought about anybody bothering us at all.
We had a school over here, the Mount Pleasant Academy, which took us through the 7th grade. And after that, then, we had to go to Charleston, to high school, which we went to Charleston High School over there on Rutledge Avenue. So we went 4 years to the college, to the high school of Charleston. But it was just a little village. Everybody was very neighborly and friendly. A lot of people had families, had married and then they married. So we were more or less, everybody was kin to each other.
Pleasant, comfortable, fearless. We had no dread of being harmed or molested anywhere. My mother didn't have a key for her door until after some years. People just knew everybody else, and we lived comfortably among each other.
Well, I guess the East Cooper area, there was more farming over here than there was anything else. There were large farms, small farms. There were old farms maybe of 25 or 50 acres. There were farms of several hundred acres. The principal crops were all truck crops, tomatoes and cucumbers, snap beans. In the wintertime, they grew what we call the winter crops, the green crops like cabbage and collards and green onions and that sort of kale and that sort of thing. We had a fellow named Floyd Weatherford. When a crop would get to a certain size, when we couldn't get in there with our own machinery, when it got too big, we'd hire him to dust for us. And he'd come over early in the mornings and dust the crops. He'd come up to a hedgerow and just fly straight up, just like that. He flew almost on the ground.
When I was a child, it was a child's heaven. We went everywhere, knew everybody, and every household knew us. And we ate all of their peaches and all of their figs, and nobody said no. We just owned the town, really.
We grew up as one big family in Mount Pleasant. I can remember my mother and father saying that you never had to worry about friends because they were always around you. You knew everybody, you knew what they were doing, and it was the same thing as when I grew up. I could come home from college and sit on the post office steps, and I could pretty well tell you 99 out of 100 people that came by and everything about them.
Oh, we went to church. We had 3 churches here for black. The Baptist, the Presbyterian, and the Methodist. My mama was a Baptist. My daddy was AME. And the Presbyterian, they didn't have much people, so we had to go to 3 Sunday school.
I was born in 1907, so I had to be less than 4 years old when 1911 hurricane hit. And the people on the islands were walking the trestle and all to get over here, the old streetcar trestle, and then get over here. And I remember my mother would go to the door and tell them, we just don't have any more beds. And they would say, well, lady, all we want to do is just get in your house. It's a solid brick house, and they knew it was strong. So we just lay down on the floor anywhere. And so they just kept coming from all around till eventually there must have been 100 people in this house laying all over the floor and sitting in chairs. And I remember the next morning, my father took me in his arms and carried me down the end of Hibbing Street where the ferry boat docked. And the whole dock was gone. That is the deck of it. The piling and the stringers were left, and the old Lawrence was still tied out at the end of it. But the whole rest of it was gone, and the story said that they didn't know whether there were 7 people killed when the ticket office blew over.
The ferries were well organized and well managed, even under the management of Charleston Isles of Palms Traction Company before it became a public service with the Cooper River Ferry Commission. The change took place between 1922 and 1926, to the best of my recollection. The boats ran a good schedule, gave good service, no complaints. They had passenger accommodation on both the lower decks, on both sides. The upper deck was the main deck. And when the Charleston Isles of Palm Traction had it, they had music, usually 2 or 3 North Sea organs. Of course, the North Sea organ known to me as an accordion. And there was always a mad rush on the holidays to get to the Isles of Palms. And Wednesdays, Fridays, and
Saturday hops at the Isles of Palms were very popular. Even when we had the motor cars took over from streetcar ferries, that we would have to make 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trips sometime to get the automobiles back to town, working 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning.
It was a delightful ride. And my father worked in town, and he said that coming back in a half-hour trip on the ferry from Charleston just washed all the cobwebs out of his mind. He and his friends sat on the upper deck and just had a grand time together. So I wish they'd do it again.
Of all the events in the history of Mount Pleasant, the old Cooper River Bridge probably had the greatest impact on life, regardless of what you may think of it now. In its day, the John P. Grace Memorial Bridge was the finest of its kind in the world.
It is just hard labor work, that's all. We started right in the bottom of that river, right down in the bottom. They drove piling down there, and they poured concrete, put steel on top of them piling. They poured concrete on that, and we started building forms coming right on up to the top. We worked right from the bottom right to the top. I was just a learner, working carpenter work, and they didn't give me but 20 cents an hour, and the head carpenters didn't get but 35.
The design was called an engineering marvel. It required 96,000 linear feet of wood, over 13,000 tons of steel, and nearly 53,000 tons of concrete. The bridge project also claimed the lives of 15 men when a scaffolding collapsed. Amazingly, 15 months after work began, the first vehicles crossed the bridge. Its opening was celebrated for days on both sides of the river, but cheering and driving are two different sensations, and motorists here had never encountered anything like it before.
The old bridge, that was quite a feat to get tourists to drive across it. I started in this area, of course, with the Charleston County Police, and it was not unusual, believe me, when I tell you that it wasn't unusual during tourist time to get calls to meet somebody at the foot of the bridge because they're scared to death to drive it. I had one occasion where I had a woman actually get on the back floor, and I heard her talking about a blanket. I don't know if she covered herself with it, but we got on the very top of the first span, and she was marveling at the tremendous view. And of course, I had to wonder why I was in the car looking at the view with her.
The company that owned the bridge was in immediate financial trouble and sold it to Charleston County in 1941. 4 years later, the state bought the bridge. Both the county and the state charged a toll to cross the bridge. In June of 1946, the toll was lifted, and there was much rejoicing on both sides of the Cooper River.
Of course, the freeing of the old John P. Grace Memorial Bridge in 1946 started it. And at that time, I said, when the bridge was freed, that we were then standing on the threshold of the greatest period of growth and development in the town's history, and that was true. And I think also the widening of this highway, Highway 17, from the foot of the John P. Grace Memorial Bridge to the intersection of Sullivan's Island Highway 703, was one of the finest things that ever happened to the town. It was the lifeblood of this community.
In early 1946, worse fears were realized when the 10,000-ton freighter Nicaragua Victory dragged its anchor during a storm and slammed into one of the bridge pilings. About 100 feet of the span was knocked out completely, and a family of 5 died when their car plunged into the Cooper River. It took 5 weeks and $300,000 to repair the bridge.
Well, of course, we had been through the terrible depression of the 30s, and we had been through 4 years of World War II, and the town was just run down. There were a lot of dilapidated buildings in the town. The water system was bad. We didn't have good drinking water. And that was one of the planks that I ran on for mayor, that I was going to try to improve the water system, which we did. And then there were so many dilapidated buildings and things that the poor black people were living in. Been there since the Civil War. And I knew that the only way that we could spruce up the town, we had such a beautiful setting to make a beautiful village out of it in the community. We needed to tear some of these dilapidated buildings and shacks down. And we ended up with 57 housing unit, which is now known as the Edmund Jenkins Housing Project. And that was one of the finest things I think we did.
Well, I was elected mayor in 1960, and the town of Mount Pleasant was a very small town at that time. And we had about 5,000 people, And within the first year after my election, we had a contested annexation election, and it was reduced back down to about 2,500. We continued to serve those who were in the area that was contested, because we figured that they had already paid their taxes and they were entitled to the services that they paid for. It was more of a civic duty than a job as the mayor of Mount Pleasant.
Because of accidents and long delays, sound familiar? In 1963, it was decided a second bridge was needed. The start of construction was a festive occasion.
We all went to the site where the original piling was being driven, and it was quite a festive ceremony out there, even though we were out in the middle of the river. But the dedication went off without a hitch. They drove the first piling, and then we all retreated to Alhambra Hall for a big celebration. And that's one of the fond memories that certainly that I have of that time. The whole town, as I can recall, was there.
3 years and $15 million later, the new 3-lane Silas Pierman Bridge opened for traffic.
The town continued to grow due to the completion of the second Cooper River Bridge. It was just waiting to happen, and it happened. And the growth has just been tremendous. We tried to stay ahead of the growth by putting in subdivision and development restrictions and road requirements. And we thought we were doing a good job until everybody wanted to grow at one time.
In 1928, Mr. and Mrs. Dana Osgood created a beautiful garden in Mount Pleasant. Now, a tranquil subdivision, Pirates Cruise was treasured by young and old alike.
The gardens were developed initially by building a seawall, a concrete seawall, for the entire length of the subdivision. You can see these columns here. These columns were put here by the Osgoods as part of their development of the gardens. The brick wall was put here. There are remnants of the gardens throughout the Pirates Cruise subdivision. We have some evidence of the popularity of the original gardens in some of the old books on Charleston gardens that are still available. Apparently the gardens rivaled Magnolia and Middleton at the time for their beauty, their scenery, and their popularity. And the gardens remained open and very active up until about 1950.
Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum is the largest such facility in the world. The keystone of the museum is the USS Yorktown, the famous fighting lady of World War II. Other vessels at Patriots Point include the destroyer Laffey, known as the ship that would not die, having survived 22 Japanese kamikaze attacks near Okinawa. The World War II diesel-powered submarine Clamagore, the former Coast Guard cutter Comanche, and the NS Savannah, the world's first nuclear-powered cargo and passenger ship.
We are completely self-sustaining. We do not receive any appropriation, either federal or state, any longer, and we support ourselves strictly on the incomes that are derived from attendance, from food sales, from golf course, and this sort of thing. So we're very happy with where we've come from, and the future looks very bright for us.
We're beginning a multi-phased project to develop Patriots Point for public use. Phase 1 includes a 616-slip marina, 104-suite hotel, about 45,000 square feet of retail space, and about 27,000 square feet of office space. Phase 2 will include renovation of the NS Savannah, the nuclear ship Savannah. There are 40 staterooms on board now that will be able to be renovated into approximately 30 hotel rooms. We'll be doing retail space on that, possibly convention center, teleconferencing, communication center, museum exhibits, movie theaters.
After convincing state officials of the need for a hospital this side of the Cooper River, the opening of the East Cooper Community Hospital climaxed a 5-year battle. Mount Pleasant now houses the newest major medical facility in the Lowcountry.
It was a struggle, but here again, it proves the power of people. You know, here again, it was an effort on the part of the people of the East Cooper community, recognizing that a hospital was needed in this area, coming together and showing support solidarity for this hospital.
Located next to Hobcaw Creek, the Ports Authority Wando Terminal is the largest industrial facility in our area. Thanks to a sophisticated computer system, few ports in the country can match us in speed and efficiency of cargo handling and documentation.
Well, when I took office in 1984 of September, we had 3,500 multifamily units online and approved. And the number one concern that I had, and most of the citizens had told me during the campaign, was that they did not want that amount of multifamily built in Mount Pleasant. So we took that upon as a major task. We revamped our master land use plan, and now that by 1992, we are hoping that we will have a ratio of 70% single family, and 30% multifamily, which will be one of the best ratios in the country.
Well, I guess it's a little ironic that after 150 years, Mount Pleasant finds itself in the grips of some pretty severe growing pains. I think the town could best be characterized as being in a position right now and having, I guess, in a position the last few years, which will continue for the next few years, of struggling to take its place among the other major cities in South Carolina. And it is a very painful process. There are a lot of the old, small town characteristics that has been so important to Mount Pleasant that people are starting to see fade away a little bit. And it's hard for a lot of the older residents. For our senior citizens, as the town grows, it's a little bit even scary, particularly in terms of traffic and increased crime and those kind of things, when they can remember when Mount Pleasant was a sleepy little town of a couple of thousand. You know, we presently have approximately 26,000 people in Mount Pleasant.
Alhambra Hall occupies the spotlight as the people of Mount Pleasant observe the 150th anniversary of the incorporation of their town. The Sesquicentennial Commission, composed of prominent business, political, and community leaders, spent nearly a year planning and organizing the week-long celebration.
The commission was formed in December of '86, and we've been working on the celebration for below these many months. And we've had regular meetings once or twice a month. We've had subcommittee meetings. We've had people running around trying to get things organized. So there really has been a joint effort here, and we're getting a lot of people from in town now coming forward to volunteer and be a part of the celebration.
Mount Pleasant, as we have seen, underwent a major population explosion in the wake of the Cooper River bridges. Many people feel it's going to happen all over again when the stretch of the Mark Clark Expressway linking Interstate 26 in North Charleston with the 17 bypass in Mount Pleasant opens in the near future.
The Mark Clark Expressway is one of the most ambitious projects in the country with a cost of over $300 to $350 million. It will have a great impact not only on the East Cooper area but Charleston County. For commerce, the movement of traffic, but with that and the Isle of Palms connector, there'll be more people visiting the beaches and have accessibility to it, and that may eliminate some of the tie-up in traffic in Mount Pleasant. When the Isle of Palms connector is completed, it will complement the I-526, and this will certainly help the traffic situation in Mount Pleasant.
And with our new highways now and the Mark Clark Expressway are going to be tying in here and enabling people to travel. And also the Isle of Palms connector will enable people to travel from the Isle of Palms and Sullivan's Island right straight to North Charleston. I just can't see anything but a continuous growth. I think we now considered the 11th. I saw where Mayor Dick Jones said the other day we're the 11th largest city in South Carolina. It's unbelievable. I visualized the growth, but I never dreamed that it would come so rapidly.
As we see Mount Pleasant today, I think we're going to see the growth continue up Highway 17 and up Rifle Range Road. The growth has already begun, and transportation is a problem. I think that it's going to be feasible to control and to develop the highway system. Until we get the completion of the Mark Clark Expressway, we're just going to have to live with the problem of the two Cooper River bridges. We might not have real cheap water, but we're going to have an ample supply, and it's going to be a good quality. They're working on the sewage treatment system now, but these are the three things that I can see we're going to have a problem with in the future.
I would like to see Mount Pleasant be back when I was a young man, but you can't hide good things for too long. And like the bumper sticker says, we've got it good in Mount Pleasant, and a lot of people are beginning to find that out.
But as Mount Pleasant continues to grow, there's going to have to be another source of water. We can't continue to put down these deep wells and supply this area, which eventually will probably wind up in Orndale, I don't know, in years to come, you know, thinking about the year 2000 and beyond. We're going to have a source of water that'll give us an unlimited supply. And that's what we're working on now.
I see, with the advent of the Mont Clark Expressway, I see us growing to the north all the way to McClellanville and perhaps even further. I envision the Daniels Island one day being developed as an industrial area. I think we'll see a spur perhaps come down off the expressway and connecting the island with the expressway. I see the area, however, continuing to grow as a residential area. And I think that we'll see rather considerable growth in the business and in commercial growth of those facilities and services required to support a growing population.
I'm afraid it's going to exceed Charleston, the way it is growing. We probably have a city limits at McClellanville or Orndale, but I approve it myself. I like to see prosperity.
Well, I think there's going to be a tremendous expansion because of the I-5 bridge being completed that will link us up to North Charleston. And once we have water and sewer in place, which we sorely need for just the 26,000 people we currently are serving. When those come online, of course, the expansion of Mount Pleasant, so many people want to move over here because it is a quality residential community, quality school system, quality people. And for that reason, I think that expansion is going to come. It will be the major challenge that any administration is going to face over the next 10 to 20 years, whoever is running the city of Mount Pleasant at that time.
Well, it's a city now, and I think it's going to be bigger and have opportunities for everybody. I know we have a nice relationship with the people in Mount Pleasant. All groups seem to have a kind of a good feeling with each other, and I think it's going to be a nice city.
I personally would sometimes like to go back to the old village days when I knew everybody, but you know, you can't go back. You have to go ahead, and I'm just glad that I was able to be instrumental in maybe laying the right foundation for its future growth.
It's too big right now, so I don't know exactly what's going to happen. It will explode, I suppose, in the near future. It is not anything like it used to be.
I see that the town is probably going to have to look at, as part of its growth posture, some fairly radical annexation considerations. And it is something that's going to be, will have to be explored, and it will be a great deal of debate, but ultimately it's going to have to be the policymakers that we have now and in the future will have to decide it. And I think the primary one would be considering the annexation of Daniel Island, which is located, as you know, just across the Wando River from Mount Pleasant. And that piece of land is larger than the peninsula city of Charleston, and there is basically no development on it. And it will be annexed by someone. I certainly foresee in the very near future the development of a regional mall shopping complex, very similar to the ones we have in Charleston and North Charleston. And when that happens, basically, Mount Pleasant and the East Cooper area, quite frankly, will become a self-sustaining entity. Other than to work, you would not have to leave the East Cooper area for just about anything. And that definitely is on the horizon.
On this trip, we have seen the humble beginnings of 5 small villages that formed the nucleus of what has become a vibrant, growing community. As in any journey, it's impossible to make all the stops along the way. But as we observe our sesquicentennial, we have gained insight as to how and why Mount Pleasant became the town it is today. Perhaps the major lesson learned from our journey through time is to honor the legacy of our forefathers, to maintain our unique lifestyle through strength, trust, and concern for one another. That's the challenge of the next 150 years. The production of A Journey Through Time was made possible in part by the following friends of Mount Pleasant.